Hi everyone, my name is Julie Lenhard, and today, for my final project, I'm going to be talking to y'all about Japan. Okay, so first, where is Japan? So Japan is a country in East Asia and is the 62nd largest nation in the world. Japan is about 379,000 square kilometers, which in comparison is a little bit smaller than California. Japan is considered the land of the rising sun because from China it appears that the sun rises from the direction of Japan. Japan does not share land borders with any countries and consists of several thousand islands. Three of the main islands include Kyushu, Honshu, and Hokkaido. All of these major islands offer something different to do and see. So of course we have to talk about Tokyo. Tokyo is the capital of Japan, and it literally is translated into Eastern Capital. It is Japan's economic and political capital. 1980s was definitely a decisive factor in placing Tokyo on the list of international fashion capitals based on the rise and influence of the Tokyo street style. It is the second largest metropolitan area on the planet, and in terms of population, it holds 30 to 35 million people. And so that's number one in terms of population on the planet. So here is just a quick image of how crazy Tokyo really is. And I don't know about you, but it definitely kind of looks like Times Square. So here are a couple fast facts that I wanted to mention. So Japan was founded as a nation in 1590. Population is about 127 million people, and so that's about 349 people per square kilometer. There are several forms of written language, but the most widely known is called kanji. The currency used is called yen, and about 100 yen is about $1. Japan is still under the constitutional monarchy system. Akihito is the reigning emperor of Japan. The two major religions are Shinto and Buddhism. They apply religion in more spiritual rather than religious and apply it to everyday life and can be seen in Japanese aesthetic, which I will talk about in a bit. But first, I want to talk about the history of the culture during the Japan era of the Heian period.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to return to medieval times. Mr. Green, finally we get to watch jousting and eat with our hands and root for the Blue Knight. Yeah, no, me from the past. For starters, medieval times doesn't closely reflect Europe in medieval times. And furthermore, we're not going to be talking about Europe in medieval times, although we will be talking about kings and courts and aristocratic intrigue. But we're going to be talking about all those things in Japan. So discussions of Japanese history often focus on the Tokugawa period because it's got ninja and samurai, but much of the foundation of Japanese culture dates to the Heian period between 782 and 1167 CE. And when I say Japanese culture, I do mean culture, because the achievements of the Heian period were primarily artistic, especially in literature. So for most of this episode, we'll be looking at cultural history as opposed to like economic or political history. As a novelist and also a consumer of culture, I'm a big fan of cultural history. What I love about it is that it embraces the human imagination. I mean, you can't just make up economic theories. Just kidding, you can. Anyway, for our purposes, Heian culture is the high culture of the upper class aristocracy, and obviously focusing on this tiny sliver of the upper class leaves out the experience of most Japanese people. But we know a lot more about the elite than we know about everyone else, because it was the elite who were doing all of the writing things down, and they were writing about the people they found the most interesting themselves. In fact, one of the reasons we know a great deal about the Heian aristocracy is because of Japan's first great novel, The Tale of the Genji by Lady Murasaka Shikibu. Now, the historian James Murdoch called the Heian aristocracy an ever-pullulating brood of greedy, needy, frivolous dilettanti, as often as not foully licentious, utterly effeminate, incapable of any worthy achievement. But when you boil all the unnecessarily fancy words out of that quote, that sounds like people I'm very interested in learning about. In fact, I love some foul licentiousness. So one of the first things we learn from texts about the Heian aristocracy is that the aristocracy was dominated by a craze for things Chinese. Now, Chinese visitors to Japan thought the country was backward and out of the way and uncivilized, civilized. But one of the reasons the Japanese seemed backwards to Chinese visitors is that the Japanese in the 10th century admired Tang China, which had flourished a couple hundred years earlier. But there was also the fact that the Japanese blended Chinese ideas, especially Chinese Buddhism, with native traditions. In fact, one of the most interesting aspects of Heian Japan was the overall attitude of the aristocracy, which was characterized by a love of color and grandeur and ceremony and ritual that was tinged with some Buddhist-inspired ideas. You know, it's sort of like how everyone in Canada wears powdered wigs and knee breeches to look like 18th century England. And one of the central ideas in Buddhism is that everything beautiful, and also everything not beautiful, is fleeting. Like historian Ivan Morris wrote that in the literature of the time there was a, quote, feeling that the familiar order of things will soon come to an end. Which, by the way, is always an appropriate feeling. So the center of aristocratic court life was the capital, Heian-kyo, which during the Heian Golden Age may have had a population as high as 100,000 people, making it much larger than most European cities at the time. It may have been a glorious capital, but we don't really know because most of the city was destroyed by earthquakes, or possibly fires, or possibly wars, or just the desire for new construction. We're not sure. We also know that the Heian aristocracy was rigidly hierarchical, with society divided into about 30 grades based on one's birth. The top 4 grades were reserved for princes, and the top 3, known as the kugyo, received all the most important privileges, including governmental posts and revenues from special rice land. These people in the highest ranks could send their children to university, wear ceremonial dress, they were given lighter punishments when they committed crimes. Can you imagine a world in which rich people systemically receive lighter sentences for crimes committed than poor people? These rules were so detailed that they even determined what type of fan you could hold. The top 3 ranks got to hold 25-fold fans. But when the Tale of the Genji was written, this rank system, like all those ranks, applied to less than 1/10 of 1% of the total population. So we're really talking about the elites. As Ivan Morris put it, members of the upper class are almost all related to each other. They are totally uninterested in everyone outside their charmed circle and exceedingly sensitive in judging the precise social level of each person who does belong. In Murasaki's milieu, to determine a person's precise standing was no simple diversion, but a matter of overriding importance. Now, that description reminds me a lot of my high school experience. Aristocrats dominated the government, which over time became more and more ceremonial and ritualistic. In fact, by the 10th century, much government work was carried out at night and consisted almost entirely of ceremonies. The nice thing about doing boring ceremonial work at night, though, there was a lot of wine. So yeah, that doesn't make for like excellent government efficiency. Heian Japan's economy was not much better than its governance. There was very little trade. An attempt at land reform, which was supposed to grant every citizen a parcel of public domain land, totally failed. Meanwhile, aristocrats accumulated vast agricultural land holdings, and by the 10th century, court nobles were largely supported by these tax-free estates called manors. Now, interestingly, the nobles didn't technically own the land outright, as they did in much of Europe. Instead, they owned the rights to income from the land, and then those rights could be transferred to their heirs. So it is similar to ownership, but it wasn't quite ownership. Also different from Europe, upper-class Japanese women could hold the rights to a manor, and thus have a rather impressive degree of economic power. And that matters a lot because women played a key role in the flourishing of Heian literary culture that makes this period of history so interesting to study in the first place. Like overall, this inefficient, corrupt cronyism of Japan's government and economy definitely weakened the state, but it also provided time and money for the aristocracy to make beautiful and interesting things. Let's go to the thought bubble. Heian aristocrats were expected to feel melancholy over the transience of existence. In Murasaki's time, according to Ivan Morris, periodical protestations of melancholy and gloom were essential for people who regarded themselves as sensitive, and sensitivity, especially to art, was the hallmark of aristocratic breeding. The aristocratic gentleman is exemplified by Prince Genji himself, quote, with his gentle nature, his sensitivity, and his wide range of artistic skills, who represented the ideal of the age and who set the tone for the social and cultural life of the good people. Buddhism was very influential on the aristocrats' aesthetic ideal that beauty must be cultivated because it is so impermanent. This quote from the Tale of Genji illustrates this focus on impermanence. Like the waterfowl that play there on the lake, I too am floating along the surface of a transient world. I couldn't help comparing them with myself, for they too appeared to be enjoying themselves in the most carefree fashion, yet their lives must be full of sorrow. Stan, are you sure that's from the Tale of Genji? I think I've seen that quote attributed to me on Tumblr. But we don't only know about the emotional state of the aristocracy, we also know about their pastimes. We refer to nobles as the leisure class for a reason, after all. They spent a lot of time playing games and engaging in contests. Poetry contests were popular, as were board games like Go, and much of their time was taken up with ceremonies and rituals. Here is an example from the court calendar. 18th day, Bowman's Wager. The New Year's celebrations are concluded by an archery contest, which is held in His Majesty's presence between officers of the inner and middle palace guards. This is followed by a banquet during which court dances are performed and prizes awarded to the winning side. Members of the losing side are forced to drink the cup of defeat. Thanks, Thought Bubble. I'd like to make an announcement here at Crash Course. From now on, whenever we refer to anyone losing anything, we will say that they were forced to drink from the cup of defeat. So, other than pure Game of Thrones style drama, this highly ritualized, very insular social order of the elites of the elites of the elites isn't usually the kind of stuff we'd study at Crash Course. But first, thinking about the Heian aristocracy tells us something about the lives of the rich and powerful generally. Like, obviously they had to increasingly separate themselves from each other to feel more and more wealthy and powerful, which progressively led to them being more and more separated from, the vast majority of people living in Japan. But also, they produced and consumed cultural artifacts that came to define the style of the age, but also have continued to shape culture. Heian aristocracy and the documents that describe it tell us a lot about women, who, as we've seen, are often left out of historical narratives. The Heian period, at least culturally, was dominated by women, particularly Murasaka Shikibu and Sei Shonagon. So in some ways, at least, unlike almost everything we've studied, our view of the period is dominated by women's perspectives, although it is the perspective of the most privileged women. And what we see is consistent with a lot of upper-class mores. These women are obsessed with their looks, and especially with their clothes, which were cumbersome and heavy. They were expected to wear their hair very long, preferably reaching to the ground. They had to powder their faces and blacken their teeth, and they lived the circumscribed lives typical of upper-class women throughout the world, although there were some legal protections that they enjoyed. Like we talked about how they could have income from property. Laws also protected them from physical violence, specifically prohibiting a husband from beating his wife, which might not sound like that big of a deal, but compared to women's lives in Europe, that was a big improvement. And upper-class women in Heian Japan were all literate and educated, although their education was limited to the types of cultural skills that would make them attractive to men. Poetry, music, calligraphy, maybe some literature. Disciplines like history and law and philosophy were mostly off limits, and that brings me to something I want to talk about. All of these privileges, from the heavy, cumbersome clothes that make it difficult to move, to the kinds of education women could have, or the kinds of limited legal protections they could have, all of that is evidence of a patriarchy. So we see through these women's stories the way that they were able to express themselves and their philosophies and the way that they lived in the world. So women like Murasaki Shikibu lived constrained, cloistered lives, but of course there were opportunities available to them that weren't available to men. And that's what's so exciting about being able to read their narratives. We just don't have many equivalents to that in Europe at the time. That noted, these women, like their male counterparts, spent most of their lives indoors and communicated mostly by intermediaries or letters. Women couldn't show themselves to men or make conversation with them, but there was a great deal of interest and intrigue around love and romance, not least because Heian gentlemen were expected to be polygamous and also to engage in extramarital affairs. But just because sexual relations were often divorced from marriage and love affairs were common doesn't mean that they lacked emotional consequences. In the stories we read about Heian Japan, everybody is always worried that they're going to fall out of favor with their lover or their husband or their whatever. It's so exciting to read about. I mean, I'm sure if you're living inside of it, it would make you very anxious. Also, when courtship and marriage had political dimensions, as they did in the highest noble ranks, women were often in danger of being displaced by a more advantageous match. And we know from the stories that all of this combined into pangs of jealousy and fear of being abandoned, and then pain when you actually were abandoned. And those kinds of stories, I'm sure I don't have to tell you, have a kind of universality about them. The last thing I want to say here is that power works differently when you're not in power, right? Like if you're a student in a high school classroom, the teacher has the power, but you have some power. And the most interesting thing about the stories from the Heian aristocracy is the ways that women used the power that they did have to bring about change in their own lives and in their communities. So by looking at history through the lens of literature, we get a very different perspective than if we were to focus on government documents or archaeology or descriptions of war. This helps us to try to develop a sense of how people at the time felt, although we're only dealing with a very limited group of people. people, obviously. The cultural achievements of the Heian period described and exemplified by the tale of Genji were considerable, especially when compared to what Europeans were accomplishing at the time. And it's another reminder that we need to be careful when we talk about the 9th and 10th centuries as the Dark Ages. It's also interesting that the Heian period in Japan wasn't particularly successful politically or economically, but that it did lead to great cultural achievements. And almost all of the literary achievements were made by women, which, as Morris points out, is a rare, if not unique, phenomenon in cultural history. For Heian Japan, the historical record was written primarily by women. And while the tale of Genji doesn't discuss politics or economics the way that we usually imagine them, and while it describes a world that leaves out 99% of Japanese people during the period, it has a lot to tell us about the way that at least some people felt and lived, which is more than can be said for a lot of history books. And that's a type of history that most of us can relate to more than stuff with generals and kings in it. For instance, when I look at the history of my own life, I find that generals and kings have played a very minor role. Jealousy, on the other hand, not insignificant. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is filmed here in the Chad and Stacey Emiggold studio in Indianapolis. Thank you for watching, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome.
So the first thing that comes to mind when thinking of Japanese clothing is the kimono. The kimono literally means clothing, however now it has come to mean traditional clothing. A kimono is a full-length robe made of silk, and it is worn by both men and women. Kimonos as we know them today came into being during the Heian period. However, as you can see in this timeline, the kimono has evolved in terms of silhouette, color, and construction. While this was the daily outfit of ancient Japanese people, because of westernization, there was a decline in popularity of kimonos, and now it has become more of a traditional attire for, said for events and festivals. There are several different types of kimonos that have many different meanings, but here are a few of the key kimono silhouettes. So the furisode is one of the most formal styles of kimonos, and it's worn by unmarried women, and it's made of very fine, brightly colored silk, and the longer the sleeve, the more formal it is. The tomesode is another expensive formal kimono dress worn by married women. They always have crests below the waist that typically have gold and silver patterns. Lastly, the utica is one of the more casual and comfortable kimonos since it is made of cotton and it's unlined. It consists of bright colors, usually with simple designs, and it's usually more or less expensive and typically worn in the summertime. Shishan is a Japanese embroidery technique that dates back to the Heian period. Symbolic motifs are embroidered on kimonos for religious ceremonies, but it soon became an art form. Because it was so costly and time-consuming, it was only available to the highest rankings of society in Japan during that time. However, since then, the technique has really been appreciated by a wider audience. So as you can see here, the traditional kimono has been adapted to contemporary design. As you can see, the drop shoulder, the generous elbow length sleeve, and a wide cut is definitely reminiscent of the traditional silk kimono. So as we saw in the crash course video, the Heian culture established a particular standard of beauty, and a geisha certainly emulates this standard. A geisha is a traditional Japanese entertainer. Geishas were fashion innovators. Some of these innovations include the wide-band obi or sash, and the hakama, which are the loose trousers or split skirt, and haori, which is an outer garment over the base of the kimono. And in comparison to regular kimonos that we spoke about earlier, these were much longer and they kind of trailed along the floor as they walked. Since they were cultural innovators, they've kind of really been able to keep that tradition alive in terms of the fashion and the classic entertainment. So here's a typical makeup remedy of geisha. The two things that I did want to point out are the two bottom pictures. So the ariashi, which is the two-pronged design on the back of the neck, means informal. And then the sabanashi, which is the three-pronged design on the nape of the neck, is meant for formal occasions. And here are a couple editorial images to see how the geisha really has been an inspiration for modern-day editorial usage. Samurai are legendary warrior noble fighters of Japan. The strangest thing about samurai is probably their kind of weird looking ornate armor. However, each piece of it was functional. Unlike the armor worn by the European knights, samurai armor was always designed for mobility and flexibility. And it really was. The armor was made of lacquered plates of either leather or metal, and it was carefully bound together by laces of leather or silk. And actually, since this armor was so efficient, the U.S. Army actually based the first modern flak jackets off of the samurai armor, so it really was that efficient. Again, these fighters were extremely noble, so their hakamas or kimonos were very ornate, and of course I had to mention the top-knot hairstyle was accepted in all social classes, but samurais particularly rocked this hairstyle to keep their helmets from falling off. And as you can see here, I've included some contemporary versions of a samurai, and of course I had to include the man bun since that is very prominent today. The appearance of Western clothing and fashion during the Meiji era represents one of the most remarkable transformations in Japanese history. The Japanese definitely borrowed and adapted styles that were practiced from Western countries, and what started out as military uniforms became a desirable symbol of modernization in Japan. And soon everyone was wearing uniforms. As you can see, it's very formal and it's a sea of black. So while this uniform culture was so prominent, the youth still was very curious about the Western culture, and from seeing these different ways of life, they didn't conform to the typical traditional values of Japan and started creating their own fashion subculture groups, and this started specifically in Harajuku. These are some of the photographs by Shoiki Aoki, and he's the creator of Fruits magazine. And he said this: "It is very difficult to mix traditional Japanese clothing elements with Western dress. For fashion designers, it approaches the realm of taboo." And I think that really does, encompass what the fashion street style how it really started. Since this uniform culture was so prominent, the youth was still very curious about the Western culture since they had, firsthand been seeing it. And from seeing these different ways of life, these groups deliberately moved away from traditional ideology and started forming their own fashion subculture group, and specifically in the city of Harajuku in Tokyo, and has now been followed around the world. So before we dive a bit deeper into the Japanese fashion subculture groups, I want to talk about kawaii. Kawaii is another modern Japanese aesthetic. Kawaii is translated into cute. This is huge in Japan and can be seen in products, advertising, media, and even in architecture. In terms of fashion, the cuter, younger, and more innocent the girl looks, the hotter she is. It is definitely a mainstream culture in Japan, and cuteness is everywhere.
これがライフスタイル。自分がこうやって生きてた方が楽しいと思ってるから私はしてるだけで、最初は衝撃的に一番今までで可愛い自分。
Tokyo, Japan. This is a land known for order and discipline, but for every social custom and rule, there are those who seek to break them. I'm here to find Decora girls. More than 10 years after this iconic fashion subculture began, a new generation is pushing the limits even further.
This is a culture where there are school uniforms here, there are uniforms for work, pretty much uniforms for everything.
Kat is a German Decora living and teaching English in Tokyo.
How does this allow you to really express who you are? Decora fashion is fun fashion. It's very against the mainstream of things. It's not in a magazine, it's not elegant, it's very much boom in your face. It can scare people a little bit. Some people just go, ooh, that might be a weird person there.
While Decora might be a direct rebellion against Japan's strict uniform culture, these girls aren't outcast or loners. In fact, some of them are celebrities.
昔両親に目立つからという理由で気にされたことはあったんですけど、
With over 500,000 followers on social media, Kurabayashi is one of the most famous Decora girls in the world right now.
友達とか待ち合わせる時とか少しポイントとしてここを使うことは
And Yunyan is one of the rare Decora boys with an equally fanatic following. I meet them at their favorite cafe, a self-styling salon in the neighborhood of Harajuku. Why do people feel that they have to come here to get ready? They can't do it at home?
原宿だったらここに来ればみんなそういう子たちが集まっているから共有することで楽しくここを使っているパターンなんですけどかわいい
How long have you both been dressing Decora?
About 6 or 7 years.
So this is your favorite Decora store?
Yes.
Fun as it may be, I have to wonder, could they be using the colourful barrettes and accessories to hide behind? You see this as being like a mask, like you're playing a character.
マスクキャラクターになりきるとか身を隠すとかっていうことは全くなくてちょっと装飾品がついたぐらいじゃあんまり気分は変わらないかな。
なんか魚はエラ呼吸するでしょ。鱗があるでしょ。なんであるのっていうのと同じ。
Kurobayashi and Junyuan seem to embody this style completely. But what did Decora look like when it first began?
今のデコラの子たちはこの頃から10年ぐらい経ってまた再びやっている子たちで。
Soshi Aoki is the founder of Fruits magazine, the most respected publication in Japanese street fashion.
が自分たちのファッションをするようになった最初のきっかけで。
He has been documenting Japanese street style for more than 20 years.
この頃生まれたデコラのファッションが日本全国に波及しているし、かなり影響力を持って人数も多かったので。
The Decora girls that I've seen have really pushed the amount of accessories they wear to the limit.
グループの中でファッションなので過激になっていってしまうんだろうなと。グループの外のファッションは彼女たちには関係ないと思うんですよね。
Japanese culture values the group over the individual. It's the way social order is maintained. Decora may be breaking the mold, but maybe it's still within the framework of what is accepted. I'm hoping to get some perspective from a Decora girl who lives outside the city.
そうですね。高校生の時に違うジャンルをやってて、ちょっとあまり触れてなかったんですよね。
23-year-old Kanae lives in the suburbs of Tokyo with her husband, baby, and extended family. Tonight, we're going to meet her friends in Harajuku, and she wants to show me how a Decora look comes together.
もともと前から着てみたいなってコーデだったんで、そのカラフルなウィッグです。アクセサリーです。
So how long does it normally take you to get ready?
お化粧から始めると2時間ぐらいですね。
2 hours?
2
Wow. How do you decide the arrangement of all the hair clips?
その日の気分と、どんどんつけてって次は何をつけれるかなっていうのがだんだん限られてくるんで、やっぱ場面でつけてますね。
Was it a slow introduction into Decora, or you just one morning decided, I like this style, and you did the whole thing?
いっぺんの方ですね。もう密かにいろいろカラフルなものを溜め込んで一気にバッてきちゃった感じですね。
The look is complete?
もうちょっとです。
Of course, a little bit more. What do you think of Kanae dressed in Decora?
特にそんなに好きなことをやって楽しんで、それでお友達ができたらそれでいいと思ってます。いいじゃない。
As we leave the grey suburbs behind, I see Kanae's demeanour begin to change. Decora isn't an elaborate costume, or even something to hide behind. It's just an outer expression of something inside that's just waiting to get out.
いやでも実際やっぱり奇抜だとは自分でも思うし、周りの子見ても思うし、でもそれが楽しかったりしますね。
Decora is empowering。なんかデコラしてる時の方が元気な気持ちになるっていうのはあるのかな。
I think it's the freedom of expression. You don't have to look every day the same. You wear the things you love the way you want to wear them. This is not a label. It's not someone else's thing. It's my thing.
原宿のファッションムーブメントが起こった多分最初からずっとこう取り続けてもう18年ぐらい。一番怖いのはまたシンプルなブーム。
Decora truly is a fearless fashion, a celebration of who you are. It's a reminder to let go of the rules and just wear what makes you feel good. Have fun with fashion.
So yeah, so as you can see in that video, you got a better understanding of what the fashion subculture really is. And so just a little bit deeper into the decora, as we saw in the video, it is very playful and childlike, and less is more definitely doesn't exist. Here are a couple more images of the decora girl in Harajuku. And so decoding decora a little bit, we did see this in the video, so I'm just going to kind of roll through it. But I just love the way how every element really does mean something, and yeah, as they said in the video, it really is just fearless, in your face fashion. Another popular fashion subculture in Tokyo is the Lolita subculture. And the Lolita is a reaction to the contemporary trend of showcasing a woman's body through form-fitting clothing. As you can see, it's very, very girly and elegant, and it's actually inspired by silhouettes and modesty of the Victorian era in Europe, as we studied throughout this course. I did include a picture of Victorian silhouettes on the bottom right corner to kind of see that comparison. There are so many subcultures in Harajuku and Tokyo. Unfortunately, we just don't have time to dissect them all. So I've gone ahead and included this image of all the different major subcultures in Tokyo. Japan is one of the few countries where their traditional culture really is still alive and is combined with modern trends, and the mix of traditional fashion and art is intermingled with contemporary fashion today. So I hope all of y'all enjoyed learning about the traditional Japanese fashion along with the contemporary, and thank you.